evening, everyone. I'm Fergus Hansen, the Director of the International Cyber Policy Centre here at ASPI. Welcome to this ASPI webinar to launch our latest publication, The Future of Assistance to Law Enforcement in an End-to-End Encrypted World. End-to-end encryption has certainly generated lots of debate. It's also been widely adopted by pretty much everyone. Everyday citizens, journalists, politicians, businesses, and civil society. Here in Australia, we've had legislation passed that has sought to ensure lawful access can still occur despite the ubiquitous deployment of end-to-end encryption, but debate continues on what more can be done. Australia has also commenced a major overhaul of its electronic surveillance legislative framework as part of the much wider Richardson review process. Internationally, developments have ensured a healthy focus on the security of devices and surveillance. We've had NSO Group's Pegasus spyware product generating a huge amount of controversy, and Australia has played its own role in the international space as part of Operation Ironside that the AFP developed with the FBI, resulting in hundreds of arrests of criminals globally. To talk about all of this and more, we have convened a terrific expert panel this evening. We have Tom Uren, who is the author of the report I just mentioned. He is also a senior fellow at ASPI. He was formerly from the Defence Department and CSIRO, and he's currently editor of the Seriously Risky Business Cybersecurity newsletter. We've got Brendan Dowling, who is the First Assistant Secretary for the Department of Home Affairs' Digital and Technology Policy Division. The division leads policy development and international engagement on critical technology security, including on telecommunications and emerging technologies, as well as national data security and strategy. And we have Claire Deavy, who was appointed as Director of Public Policy for WhatsApp in 2019. She joined Facebook in 2015 and was previously Director of Community Affairs for Asia Pacific and Latin America. And I want to especially acknowledge the support of Meta and Google in enabling this research to take place. We really value the partnership, and it's been, I think, a really fantastic product that Tom has put together. The format for this evening, we're going to have, I'm going to throw to Tom quickly just to give us a bit of an update on an overview of what this report's about. There's going to be some questions from me, and then I'm going to open it up to everyone listening in this evening. So please get your questions ready. Please submit them through the platform. Vote up the questions that you like the most. I'll do my best to be democratic about it and choose the questions that most of you, the largest number of people, have supported, but I'll jump around a little bit as well. So with that, I would just wanted to start by handing to Tom to see if you could tell us a little bit about what this new report of yours is all about.
Yeah, g'day. Thanks, Fergus, and great to be here virtually tonight or this evening. So really the report is what can be done to assist law enforcement in a world where communications are ever increasingly end-to-end encrypted. And I think it's fair to say that in the encryption debate is fairly polarized. People tend to believe either in end-to-end encryption all the time, or in government gets exceptional access, and people don't try and talk to the middle of the debate. So this paper is really an attempt to just bring together a menu of options that could be used to try and get some traction and to put everyone on the same, I guess on the same playing field, to just make the debates and the arguments explicit so that people know they're talking about the same thing. So I'll assume that everyone listening tonight has their own personal definition of end-to-end encryption. The one I came up with was that only the sender and the recipient have the key to understand a conversation or to be able to decrypt it. And I thought the process, so in doing this paper, I talked to a whole lot of different stakeholders across both government and industry. And I think it's fair to say that there is no, even though Brendan will express a government view, there's different views within government, and there's also different views within industry. And so whenever you talk to people, and perhaps to lawmakers in particular, they want roughly three things. They want strong encryption, they want security and privacy, they want child protection, and they want access for law enforcement. And at least to some extent, some of those goals or desires are in tension. And in the paper, I look at the different types of what different problems people are really talking about. And I break them down into two very broad categories. So one category is problems where the service is actually really essential for the crime to take place. So in that category, you might put harassment, child sexual abuse material, and also bullying and non-consensual image abuse. So without a messaging platform or a social media platform, those crimes just simply don't take place. There may be other crimes in the real world that are sort of analogous. And for those types of crimes, I really think a platform is in a position to kind of change the game without necessarily affecting end-to-end encryption. So the eSafety Office talks about safety by design, and I think there's a lot of small steps that are that don't affect end-to-end encryption at all that people could take. And no doubt Claire will talk perhaps about what steps Meta or WhatsApp has taken. So some of those might be, for example, just knowing what age people are and then stopping adults reaching out to children that they don't know. Perhaps there's some default encryption that's applied to children's conversations that is different from adults. There's really a whole raft. It's kind of limited by your imagination more than anything else. And I think I think of that a bit like teachers in a schoolyard. You don't need to listen to every conversation to know that some kids are being bullied. You can see that by looking at the behavior of kids in the schoolyard. And I would sort of, in this analogy, someone like Meta or a company like Meta is in the sort of the place of a teacher. You don't need to listen to every conversation to have a good idea of what's going on. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. There's also a second class of crime where the messaging platform is just used to facilitate something that happens in the real world. So that might be drug trafficking, any kind of serious crime, conspiracy, collusion. And in those types of crimes, a social media company's not really in the same situation, I don't think. And so those are the sorts of crimes where police would like exceptional access. So in the paper, I talk about different proposals for exceptional access and just spell out the benefits and the risks. There's a section on how the real world is different from the physical world. So in the real world, people accept that police have powers to search a premises under warrant. And that doesn't really have an implication for anyone else. So if my neighbor gets searched, that doesn't make my house less secure. In the virtual world, there's an argument that making a system so that it can allow exceptional access makes it weaker for everyone. So those are the sorts of arguments I try to bring out and make explicit in the paper. One final point, I think there's a lot of opportunity for the use of metadata to help in both types of online harms. There's, intelligence. I think most famously, General Michael Hayden said that we use metadata to kill people. And Australia already has a metadata retention scheme. So police will say that metadata is not convincing to judges and juries. And so perhaps my suggestion might be to just educate people about it. I think there's, given that metadata is very powerful, I think there's probably a separate discussion to be had about what the appropriate restrictions on the use of metadata are and whether they're at the right place. But setting that aside for this discussion, I think there's an opportunity there as well. Also, doing this research, I think, has given me a perspective on the debate, a broader perspective than when I started. And I really think we're at the position we are because lawmakers would like to have exceptional access, but they're worried about the arguments that I present in the paper. And so they've actually stopped at trying to impose it through legislation. And I expect, I think that a lot of what we used to get from exceptional access, we now get through legalized hacking, where law enforcement will get a warrant to be able to hack a particular person's device. And I expect that for the short term, at least, or maybe even the medium term, that will continue. We won't impose stronger legislation on end-to-end encryption. Lawful hacking will continue. As security gets better and that gets more difficult, I think that'll be when this debate maybe sparks up again.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Tom, and thanks for all the effort putting together this paper. I think it provides a really interesting typology for understanding this issue, and also some really constructive suggestions about how industry and government can work collaboratively to progress things in this area. Brendan, if it's okay with you, could I get you to outline what the main issue with end-to-end encryption is from a government's perspective? And I guess given what Tom just said about the existing approaches from law enforcement, what gaps are there that the Assistance and Access Act doesn't yet address and are still sort of issues for law enforcement?
Sure. Thanks, Fergus, and thanks, Tom, for the outline of your report. I think to summarise broadly our perspective, what we're seeing is the increasing use of end-to-end encryption across all crime types. So all crime that can be conducted online, people are using end-to-end encryption as a means to obfuscate, to hide what they're doing. So essentially, it's made it easier to share any kind of criminal tradecraft or planning. And in particular, and we focus on this issue a lot because it is one that alarms us, it has made it easier to share child abuse material than it has ever been before. Now, obviously, those issues are not solely caused by encryption, but it has made it easier for pedophiles to share child abuse material. We've seen that catastrophic explosion in the sharing of online child abuse material. And it has made it harder for law enforcement to access digital electronic evidence. So it has made investigations harder. It has made it harder to identify the perpetrators of those types of crimes. It's made it harder for child protection NGOs to identify online child abuse material. And it's made it harder for them to work hand in hand with law enforcement. Now, our strong sense is that problem is getting worse, not better. So we've seen an extraordinary proliferation in, again, focusing on online child abuse material. I don't think we have a sense, I don't think anyone has a sense that we have a good handle on that issue and that we are managing to get a handle to prevent it. What we're seeing is it is getting worse. Now, none of this is to say that we are, from a government perspective, opposed to end-to-end encryption. End-to-end encryption is critically important for cybersecurity. We recommend its use and adoption. We're not looking for a mass surveillance technique. We don't have a hidden agenda on this issue. What we are looking at is how we deal with some of those most critical crimes. I've mentioned the child abuse material issue, planning for terrorist attacks, other organised crime activities, drug trafficking. What we have a sense of the way those criminals operate to use online communication, digital tools is evolving and is very innovative, and we are losing ground in our powers to address that. Not solely because of end-to-end encryption. All of these crime types have a multifaceted response. So there's no suggestion that we are saying if we have some form of lawful access, as Tom's describing, that we will suddenly solve all these crimes. In fact, access to digital evidence is often only one component of the investigation that police might be conducting. But to take it to a broader perspective on the online environment, we're seeing that what we call the going dark issue, which most of you would be familiar with, is the ability to hide these sort of activities online, is not just about end-to-end encryption. It is getting worse as end-to-end encryption gets adopted more ubiquitously, but it is also going to be made exceptionally more difficult by the adoption of cryptocurrencies, by VoIP services, by VPNs. And what we're looking at is over the coming years, as these sort of tools become default, become ubiquitously accessed, the going dark issue actually gets to the lights out point, that law enforcement, that community safety organisations actually lose visibility on not only content, but potentially on much of the metadata that is used in enforcement. Again, this is not me saying that we want to stop the rollout of encryption. This is about how can government, industry, civil society, academics work together to find solutions to that issue and to stop the inevitable, potentially, deterioration of investigatory capabilities here. I think Tom's report does an excellent job of trying to get past that binary. You can either have privacy or you can have safety, and saying, actually, there are middle ground options. So I really am grateful for the opportunity of this forum tonight to get to a more constructive and more sensible conversation where there are options, there are tools that are out there. They don't do everything for everyone, but what we need to get to is a very constructive, very transparent conversation amongst the players who deal with the technology and who deal with the law enforcement side of things, of what is going to help us not lose control of the interweb, as colloquialism, of the internet, and introduce essentially dark web functionality to the clear web in a ubiquitous and widespread way.
Great, thank you so much, Brendan. Well, I think you sort of touched on what the views on Tom's proposals, and maybe I'll come back to you on some specifics around that. But Claire, would it be possible to get your views from an industry perspective? What balance are you trying to strike here, and what do you make of Tom's proposals?
Yeah, first of all, Fergus and Tom, thank you for the report. It's great to be part of this and the opportunity to be sitting here, and Brendan, to have you here. As you indicated, the idea that the sectors can start to come together to have a collaborative discussion, I think, is a really important way forward. I have, as part of my role, I sit right across Asia Pacific, and as part of that, I have conversations with people like Brendan from Home Affairs of various countries, with people that are working in safety and looking at safety by design, with human rights defenders and journalists. And it really is an education around different perspectives around what safety means to people. I couldn't agree more, Brendan, with you that the idea that end-to-end encryption has become a standard industry-wide technology, and that is for everyone. And it is one of the best ways available to protect people's data, especially in kind of the global situations that we've got going on at the moment. But it does pose a legitimate question, and that is, how do we ensure the safety of users if no one but the recipient and the sender can see the message? So from WhatsApp's point of view, we don't have access to people's personal encrypted messages. So we can't provide the details of these messages to law enforcement or government. But that doesn't mean just because we can't see the content that we don't think we should be taking responsibility and working to see what we can take action on for bad actors. You indicated this talking about metadata. There are signals, there are behaviors, and certain unencrypted surfaces, such as user reporting, that we use to help, that protects people's privacy by not exposing all their messages back and forth, but allows us to work on safety as well. So when government agencies and law enforcement make requests to us, we work through the standard procedures that are set up internationally to see how we can assist. And I really appreciate that law enforcement agencies face such a range of challenges in detecting and combating crime. And as you said, some of them are technological, but more and more we're seeing that there are behavioral challenges like bad actors switching phones or taking steps to avoid detection. And how do we look at those behaviors and what we have access to in an encrypted environment to work together across industry and academia, really to reflect those realities, but still protect the security and, most importantly, the privacy of our users? From the WhatsApp perspective, I just mentioned this briefly, we are really trying to innovate, and we're, I think, at the forefront of looking at how do we use the behaviors of accounts, the way accounts interact with each other, how the user reports that we're given, so we're able to remove people from the platform if it appears that they're doing something incorrect. And when law enforcement comes to us for things such as child exploitation images, that we are making reports to NCMEC. I think we made around 400,000 last year reports through using these unencrypted spaces that we have.
Great. Tom, maybe I can just, we talked about some of these options that, and I think Brendan characterised it as these middle ground solutions that you've come up with in this report. Could you talk us through the recommendations or the proposals that you have put forward that you think are going to be the lowest hanging fruit to deliver the biggest gains in this area?
Yeah, so I hesitate to describe them as recommendations so much as a menu of options. Yeah. I think Claire touched on it already. User reporting, I think, is actually a big one, in the sense that if you make it easy and acceptable for people to report things, they will. And if you look at the different messaging apps I use, there's some where it's almost literally impossible. I wouldn't know how to. And I think especially for younger people, making it both obvious and acceptable is something that could make a huge difference to reporting. And that's something that I think is both, that's just a good thing. My sort of retrospective history of the internet is that people built these services without ever really thinking through the implications. And so I think there's a lot of I guess maybe rework is the wrong word, but a lot of things that could be done that would improve the situation, and also by making it a standard across different services. I think there's difficulties there, though, because there's really differences in the way different platforms seem to treat the situation. So I think I would agree with Claire that WhatsApp has been very forward-leaning. A company or an organization like Signal, it seems to be, and like, I'm a fan of Signal, I use Signal, I like Signal, but they're also ideologically, I would describe them as ideologically driven, and they don't want to do anything like that. So from a societal perspective, I guess the question is, what's the right thing to do there? I think there's also a lot of ground. Well, one of the proposals that I kind of liked, but which is, I mean, it seems to have died in a ditch, is the Apple proposal for on-device scanning. And I accept that this introduces risks to users, but I also think that given the problem we're facing, that perhaps it's actually the least of, it may be the least bad option.
Tom, can you just interrupt you? Can you just tell people a little bit what that is, just for those who don't know about it?
Yeah. So Apple proposed that they use on-device. If you were sharing photos in an iCloud group, that it would compare the photos you were going to be shared with a list of known bad images. And it would use a clever algorithm where it would never actually know what the photo was, only that it matched. And if there were a certain number of matches, it would then tip off I think it was NCMEC, the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children in the States, and that could potentially allow the images to be passed to law enforcement. So Apple did quite a bit of work to make it as cryptographically sound as they could, but of course, I think it comes back to the polarized debate. People hated it as well. So there are these kind of innovative proposals that I think just die because the debate doesn't allow those middle ground solutions to be explored at all. Now, having said that, I'm not a cryptographer, so I don't, and I think this is also part of the debate. Part of the problem with the debate is that there's some people who will, it appears to me at least anyway, who will reflexively dismiss a solution or a potential solution without, I think, to me, that seems like the sort of proposal that should have taken months to either dismiss or endorse, but the dismissals come very, very quickly. So I think there's, well, I guess the whole paper is an attempt to try and bring people together rather than have a continually polarized debate.
Thanks, Tom. I might come back to Brendan and Claire on their reactions to those proposals, but I just wanted to pick up on the point you made around certain, a company like Signal, which you described, I think, as having an ideological position about not taking action on these issues to ensure there's, just wanting to have end-to-end encrypted messages and very secure messages. Brendan, I guess my question to you is, if we are talking about, providing exceptional access to different technologies, and the criminal world becomes aware that you have these capabilities, what's to stop criminal groups from just pivoting into a platform that they know is not going to be cooperative with law enforcement, and they can just get around it anyway? Isn't this just an endless cycle going down that sort of that avenue?
Sure. Look, I mean, criminals are innovative. They are quite sophisticated in their understanding of the different tools online. We see on the dark web very open sharing between, say, pedophile networks about what platforms to use, what platforms might have better tools at detecting child abuse material online, and to avoid those and use different tools. So there will always be that innovation in digital tools that will be exploited by criminals. That doesn't mean we sort of cede the territory to them and say, oh, well, they're going to figure out another approach, so we might as well just let them have at it. Which is partly because, firstly, when you're talking about, and I'll continue, well, I mean, you can apply this example to the child abuse example, you can apply it to terrorist content. People don't start necessarily in the deep dark web collaborating on these sort of crimes. There is often commencement of communication, commencement of sharing material on the clear web. If you look at a crime like the online grooming of children, that starts on the clear web. So it is unlikely that criminals will holus bolus move to platforms that are inaccessible in any way, shape or form. Yes, highly sophisticated criminals will do that. They will be on top of that. But the mainstream platforms are mainstream and are used by lots of people for good reason, because they have wide networks, because they have access to new people, new recruits in the case of terrorist communication. So there will inevitably be that sort of movement, but that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile targeting more mainstream platforms. We will get to the other platforms. We will continue to find ways to innovate from a government perspective to try and tackle that. That's not easy. A lot of these platforms are not based in Australia, say, but we don't sort of give up, I guess. We focus on the mainstream platforms. We try to solve some of these heinous issues there, and then we might have a different approach when it comes to some of those more sophisticated platforms where you might have your, far more experienced, far more savvy criminal operating.
Thanks a lot, Brendan. Maybe I'm going to come to audience questions very soon, so please submit your questions through the questions tab. Vote each other's questions up and down, or up, rather, and I will come to you very soon. I just wanted to get your perspectives, Claire and Brendan, on the proposals Tom's just talked about, or others in the menu of options in the paper that maybe haven't been mentioned. Where do you see the opportunity for the greatest impact, where industry and government are in agreement and we can get forward progress together? Maybe I can start with you, Brendan.
Sure, thanks. Look, as I said, the great thing about the report is it identifies that there are a suite of options. None of them in of themselves get to comprehensively get to the issues as I've been describing them. I think it's worth spending a minute on the neural hash proposal from Apple. So as Tom described it, what we're talking about is a client-side privacy respecting mechanism to scan for known child abuse material. So not just scan for people's pictures of their babies in the bath on the phone, but known child abuse material that has been registered on a hash database as being a known image, scanning for that in a way that never looks at the photo. It only looks at the digital footprint. So there is no visibility of content. There is no lawful access. That proposal gives no access to law enforcement, to the police, or anything like that. And yet, they couldn't even get that across the line because of the backlash from activists in the community. Now, the privacy lobby is an important lobby. Privacy online is a hugely important issue. But I think it's a failure on all our parts that a sensible privacy-preserving approach like that could had such a rapid and comprehensive backlash. I will say from our perspective, I think between government and child protection groups, we were not active enough. This shows there are technological tools out there that can be developed that come at that issue, that aren't about lawful access, but are about protecting online safety. So I think it's important that we don't give up and we don't fall into that binary trap, because there are tools, there are people working in the industry, there are people working in government on tools that can actually address some of the most heinous parts of this issue. I think to not suck up too much time, I'll just touch on some of the other proposals. User reports are important. You look at the Online Safety Act that Parliament has recently passed and came into effect. That creates a huge amount of mechanisms for users to report the violations of their safety, whether it's image-based abuse, whether it's cyberbullying. That's important, but we cannot put the onus on victims to be the ones to come forward, particularly when we are talking about situations where there might be coercive behavior, there might be grooming. The idea that the solution is that if you are a victim, you will come forward and report it is just not adequate from our perspective. It's part of the solution, no doubt. Metadata sort of falls into the same category. Metadata is a huge part of what investigatory, I'm not going to try that one again, efforts look at. It is part of any sort of approach, but it doesn't get at content. And for some of the crime types we're talking about, content remains an important part of things. As I said earlier, we're also in danger of losing some of that valuable metadata with some of the anonymizing technologies that are coming into place. So in short, I think there's a lot of good ideas from Tom there, but as he said, they're options, many of which we can pick up more, need to be deployed more, need to be worked on more. In of themselves, no one of them is a solution to the overall issue.
Great, thank you, Brendan. So Claire, where are the options from your perspective that are right for the greatest movement forward in this area?
I was like madly taking notes while you were all talking and trying to kind of collect the thoughts around it. So let me answer in a kind of a roundabout way. I think first of all, a discussion that we had around the ideological position for WhatsApp for us the encryption of people's messages and the right to have a private message between two people is kind of baseline for us when we look at what we're doing. And we saw kind of when there was, the incorrect assumption towards the beginning of last year that people thought we didn't have encrypted messaging, that people voted and, very quickly felt that they needed to move to other services till they realized we have the same encryption protocol as Signal and the messages are encrypted. One of the other things that you spoke about, Brendan, was the idea that there are different parts to this. So I think it is important to delineate between social media, what is your private messaging world, and the dark web. And what tends to happen is everything gets lumped in together into one big thing, as if it is the same place, the same issues, and the same way to deal with it. So not my full area of expertise, but if I zoom back a bit as part of the Meta family, what you see is our first line of defense is to try and stop these things happening. And really the Meta team and the Facebook and Instagram team have been the front of, in an open social platform, how do you limit access to people? How do you make sure that minors are protected? What are the things that you can do there? Then when you move into this encrypted space, we're looking at, okay, how do we as an encrypted space maintain that privacy of messages, but pull these pieces together? And photo DNA, I think, is a fantastic example of when industry has come together to say, we have the ability to fingerprint these images and now videos. I think X-ray is another one. And then industry shares the bank of images so we can all work on the issue together and report it. So when we look at those technologies, there are a number of, so the unencrypted spaces, your photo on WhatsApp or your group photo are spaces where we have the ability, and we scan them with photo DNA to try and catch at the outset. When people send user reports, again, they're all run through the same technology when we get the report to look for these known images without people having to see it. And it's important to think about, as Brendan said, all these things work together. So our team it's not like there is a silo for user reports, a silo for scanning. We're looking at how the accounts, how they're acting abnormally, what are the behaviors of the accounts. And every time we get a report, this helps us build kind of what is the case around this account. And if we believe a cluster of accounts is potentially sharing any, whether it is, dangerous organizations or child exploitation, we will take action and remove the accounts from the platform. So I think it's absolutely critical that we don't talk about each of these things as, well, if we just do this, it's okay, we just do this. The important thing is, how do we bring them together? How do we support NCMEC to make sure the reports that they get are usable and helpful to law enforcement when they get it? What is the metadata that's available at the point when the investigation is happening that we can assist? So I do think it's an important debate and discussion, which is why it's so important that we're here today talking about it.
Thank you so much, Claire. I'm going to throw to some audience questions now. And if you haven't submitted one yet, please do via the question tab, and please vote up each other's questions. I'm going to go to a question from Patrick first, who has the most voted question. And Patrick, Brendan, it looks like it's going to be a question to you. He says, how does Brendan see the government's use of metadata and analytics to identify criminal activity generally, rather than in investigation of a particular crime?
Can you just repeat that for me, Fergus?
Yeah, so how does Brendan see the government? I wonder if you're going to have a different view from the government, Brendan, but how does Brendan see the government's use of metadata and analytics to identify criminal activity generally? So rather than in a particular crime, I guess, is metadata, I take it to mean, is metadata and the analytics around that useful for broader law enforcement activities or other activities? Perhaps that's the tenor of the question.
Sure, and I'm probably going to disappoint you in my answer, Patrick, noting that I've come from the policy side of the Home Affairs Department rather than the law enforcement, so I'm not intimately familiar with the techniques that we use on a sort of regular basis in our enforcement work. I think one thing, if I can pivot slightly on that, is it is important for us to recognise in what is a global debate around the use of things like metadata that we come from a society where we have a democratically elected government, where we have transparent laws passed by our parliament and where we have accountability, review and oversight mechanisms. When we utilise and access things like metadata, it's under those terms that are set by the parliament and only in those circumstances. What we do see is the exploitation of some of that data by authoritarian regimes in a way that is extrajudicial, that is not subject to accountability to the people. And I often find when I'm talking to people about these types of issues, there is a moral equivalence argument which I reject, which is that if you do these sorts of things in Australia, then authoritarian regimes, well, they might do the same thing. They might learn from you. There's 2 points that I think are critical here. One is we don't set the terms of our laws based on what authoritarian regimes do. We set them based on the fact that we have a democratically elected parliament that passes laws. Again, transparency, accountability, etc. But also, authoritarian regimes don't need inspiration from us to surveil their own people. They're pretty good at doing that and figuring out for themselves. So when I look at some of the criticisms or the risks identified on these sort of powers being adopted here, I just don't accept that that's an argument to not do these things and to not pass laws focused on public safety, where in the event that authoritarian regimes utilise a similar thing, when there is no equivalence between those two.
I have something to add, Fergus, if you like.
Yeah.
I've got an intelligence background, and metadata can be tremendously powerful. So part of me is conflicted because I don't like the idea of government having access to a whole lot of metadata because it's so powerful. However, and I certainly don't like the idea of a police person conducting whatever sort of investigation on metadata they feel like. But I also think there's a place for targeted use of metadata to try and investigate particular crimes. And so that may, in an ideal world, be something like, dear magistrate, I have this analytic that I want to run on metadata, and it will identify drug smugglers because they're always talking at a particular time of day, or whatever it is that works that identifies a particular class of criminal. And if a judge signs off on that and it has particular oversight, I think that's probably okay as a way to discover new criminals. I think also there's and I think the important part is a justification and oversight that it's used appropriately.
I might just jump in as well on metadata. You know, in terms of WhatsApp, our aim with the metadata is to collect the minimum amount of metadata we need to run the service. So there is minimal metadata that we have. And in terms of when law enforcement would like access to it, there is a legal process that includes the MLAT process to go through the US to allow us to release the metadata. So I do want to make sure people don't think that the metadata is all open and everyone has access to it and there's this kind of wealth of it floating around. I do think this idea, as you were saying, Tom, is how do we understand what is the most effective? How do we preserve privacy for the vast majority of people who are not doing anything inappropriate on the service, and really digging into those, what is the metadata and when is the right time to access it?
Maybe I'll go to a question from Wahid, because he's talked about, I think it picked up a little bit of what you were saying, Tom, about, what should be the circumstances under which these powers are used. And the question there is, some of the criticism at Apple's child sexual abuse material detection proposal seemed to be that the hash list could one day extend to other fingerprinted photos. And the question is, how can government and industry work together to implement these measures to protect children while still providing confidence and privacy assurance to average users? And I guess, and we've had a couple of questions like this around mission creep that, it applies to, there's obviously child exploitation material that everyone can agree with, but there's all these lesser crimes as well that can be potentially looked at, and how do we deal with that kind of issue? So I'll just throw that to the panel broadly, if that's all right.
Yeah, so Apple, I think after the initial backlash, they modified their proposal where the database of hashes that Brendan spoke about would be from 2 separate jurisdictions. So they tried to separate who was responsible for it. I think the problem that underlines this question is that people just don't trust government that much. And there's in the sort of countries I think about as operating as a bloc, so Australia, the US, the UK, or at least not operating as a bloc, but collaborating on these issues, there's different levels of trust in government. And particularly in the States, when it comes to law enforcement, I think there's less trust that law enforcement will do the right thing. And if you start from a position where you don't trust the government, I think these proposals will always face a lot of headwinds. So unfortunately, my paper's not going to solve that.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, there is, aside from, I think the technical community came out, there's a number of great papers around this. Brendan referenced it before. But there is also, with the onus on industry, the way people feel about having industry scan their phone looking for something, I think is, in addition to distrust of government, understanding how people feel about that is very important. And I said, with all of these technological solutions, there is no way to say, well, if we just do it for this use case, once the technology is invented, we'll make sure nobody else uses it. And we've seen that with surveillance software and other things as well. There is no way to ensure that what you've built is only used for the purpose it was built for when it comes to these type of accesses.
Yeah, I think, look, I mean, the slippery slope argument can be applied to any policy out there. It's a lazy argument, I think. We can set up guardrails around these things. Photo DNA has been around for well more than a decade. What we haven't seen is the abuse of photo DNA technology. What we have seen is that it remains our most effective tool to counter the proliferation of child abuse material. And I won't run through the stats here, but for anyone who doesn't know, look at the NECMEC reporting, look at the New York Times reporting that illustrates the exponential growth in the sharing of child abuse material online. What we need is it's not that we're inventing new tools that can be used for malicious purposes. What we're talking about is applying the tools in new ways to identify what is a worsening problem. We are seeing platforms lose visibility. We know that there are millions of reports made by Facebook every year on online child abuse material. We know that other platforms report thousands of images of child abuse material every year. Visibility over that content is going to reduce as some of these encryption and other these other tools are rolled out. So in the face of rolling out tools that actually reduce the visibility, reduce the ability to protect children, reduce the ability to investigate those crimes, what we're talking about are moderate, limited proposals that industry has developed to find ways to counter that spread. The idea that we wouldn't do this because we're worried about a hypothetical future scenario where a tool that hasn't been misused in that way before might potentially be misused in another way, and that we're okay with the proliferation of child abuse material because of that argument, I just don't think is acceptable. I think this is where the energy of industry, the energy of government needs to come in and say, this is not the Wild West days of the internet. We are not sort of letting this happen on our watch. We're going to use these types of tools. We're going to develop new tools, and we're going to use them in the ways for which they're built and intended. If we need to put guardrails around that, then let's do that. But I think we've got a pretty good track record. Industry has a pretty good track record in deploying things like photo DNA, which, by the way, we need video DNA to use the same tools to identify video-based material. We've been doing it for a long time. We need to actually use the tools that we have.
I think that evolution you were just talking about there is right. So one of the things that we have pioneered is the use of a thing called X-ray, which does allow us to scan videos in the same way that photo-DNA is used, and that's now shared across industry. And again, this comes back to putting the pieces together of the metadata, the user reports, using those, using kind of this opportunity for the whole tech industry to come together to share the information that they have and to build those banks is absolutely critical.
Thank you. Going to go to a question from Lauren, and she asks, with Australia having far-reaching powers through legislative control such as Identify and Disrupt and Assistance and Access Acts, what are the panel's thoughts as to the potential of and risks associated with regulatory arbitrage within the context of international law enforcement collaboration? So I guess would other jurisdictions be requesting access via Australia's, the acts that are in, the powers that are in place here in Australia? I don't know if anyone wants to take that question.
I'm happy to jump in first. I think, and we need to be clear on how limited some of those powers are. I think there was a perception around the time of the passage of the Assistance and Access Bill that there was that legislation was, breaking encryption, introducing backdoors, introducing vulnerabilities. There was a big sort of in consultation processes and publicly, there was a lot of concerns expressed. It doesn't do any of those things. It explicitly prohibits any systemic weaknesses being introduced to platforms. We are not allowed to do that. We're not allowed to ask a company to do that under that law. In fact, it actually is pretty limited in its application. It largely creates an industry cooperation framework, which allows government to make requests for industry assistance within those bounds, to compel industry assistance within those bounds. I can tell you, in the years of operation of Assistance and Access, we have not issued a technical capability notice asking a company to develop a new tool to get at encrypted data. We've largely issued cooperative assistance requests. We've issued one technical assistance notice, which does compel that cooperation. That was issued at the request of the company, asking that we do compel them so that they then could cooperate with us. So those sort of tools have been applied in very limited ways, in ways that are consistent with the boundaries set around it by the Parliament. I do think there is a positive one-upping in some respects of what appropriate laws are applied to these sort of issues. Australia has passed a number of pieces of legislation most of you would be familiar with, trying to come at the issue of online harms. The EU is looking at different approaches. The UK and Canada are looking at different approaches. The US talks about a lot of different approaches, but congressional politics means it's pretty difficult to actually move things forward. That creates a degree of uncertainty in the global regulatory environment, but we are dealing with a lot of greenfields regulation here. So I don't think it's a bad thing that countries look to each other and adopt tools, look at where tools are employed in one place have worked or not worked, and then build on those. And we gradually get to a smarter regulated online environment. We're not naive to the concerns about the way that the internet is being splintered by authoritarian regimes applying different approaches. That is something that internationally we're working to counter, but there is room, and most industry companies have said this as well, there is room for smarter regulation to deal with some of these issues, and countries working in concert with each other to figure out what that is a good process.
I might sort of run with that and pivot to Ironside, because Patrick's asked a question about that. So one of the Ironside was an operation where the FBI and the AFP and maybe someone else collaborated on setting up a secure messaging platform that was marketed exclusively to criminals. And so the AFP AFP set it so that they were, I guess, BCC'd into every message. So there was genuine end-to-end encrypted messaging, but it just happened that the AFP was a sort of undisclosed recipient to every message. And so in that case, and it's also been my experience that law enforcement agencies work very hard to operate within their remit. So the FBI had some convoluted process where they weren't fed intelligence from this operation. And so in a sense, the AFP was probably the major beneficiary, and the FBI had to meet some legal requirement, which I can't remember the details of. So Patrick, so that's, I guess, an example of cooperation within the relevant laws of different jurisdictions. And so I wouldn't call it arbitrage so much as just cooperation. Patrick asked if won't criminals stop using those sorts of platforms if they believe they're not safe? Well, so far the evidence is that criminals will continue to use what I call crime phones because they don't like the alternatives, which are other services. So there've been maybe 3 or 4 different crime phone, so Phantom Secure, EncroChat, Ironside, and I think one other where international law enforcement operations have seized control of the whole network and resulted in very large busts. So the problem with commercial services is they run on commercial phones, and criminals don't trust that they can't be compromised. So they tend to strip out all the other functionality, and you're left just with something that can only send an encrypted message and nothing else. So I think criminals have a kind of tough choice. They know that police will always go after those sorts of encrypted messaging platforms because they're just chock full of targets, frankly. And I mean, I really have to congratulate the AFP and the FBI on that operation. I think it's great. But until they feel confident that they can use a commercial phone, I don't think they'll do that either.
Tom, I really love the way that you seamlessly took over the moderator's role of asking yourself your own questions. That was brilliant, truly excellent. Claire, I'm going to give you the last word. We're coming up to time. I don't know if you want to jump in there or any final remarks from you. And feel free to ask yourself a question as well if you'd like, in the spirit of Tom you're in.
I think he's raised the bar too high, but I think thank you for the opportunity to kind of do a sum up. As I said at the beginning, these are really difficult conversations, and I think being on this panel and starting from like a shared idea that we want to work on safety, we think that privacy is important, has been critical. And having worked, as I said, in this company now for 3 years and seeing the innovation around how do we use these behaviors? How do we understand what is happening? And that is everything from some of these terrible crimes that we've been speaking about, like child exploitation and terror, right down to working on scams and fraud and anything that's on the platform. How do we use everything we learned from behaviors to really counter that on WhatsApp? Because ultimately we want to have the best private space that we can with the safest for the people that are using it. So thank you again for the opportunity to be on the panel. And Tom, I really appreciate the report. I think you laid out so well all the different options and the things that are being weighed up in different ways by different countries around the world.
Great. Well, thank you all. I've had so many conversations and meetings on end-to-end encryption, and very rarely are they constructive and positive. So it's really great that Tom's been able to strike a middle road, I think, between industry and government here and come up with some really, I think, eminently sensible and very constructive proposals. So congratulations to you, Tom, and thank you so much for your hard work in pulling that all together. And thank you so much, Claire and Brendan, for joining us to offer a perspective from industry and government as well. We really appreciate it. And thank you for everyone that submitted questions. I'm so sorry I couldn't get through every single one, but I really appreciated all the perspectives that came through there. And thank you all for joining us. It's been a really wonderful conversation, and look forward to seeing you at the next ASPI event.
Thanks, everyone.